They told you the land was empty. They told you the pioneers broke the first soil, that the settlers cleared the first trees, that the farmers who came with plows and ox carts were the ones who made this continent productive, that before them there was nothing but wilderness, nothing but forest and prairie and silence. That is one of the most successful lies ever told. And the proof isn't buried in some obscure archive. It's in the ground beneath your feet. It's in the genetic memory of seeds that still exist. It's in canal systems that predate any recorded European construction. It's in soil that tells a story the history books refuse to acknowledge. It's in the oral records of peoples whose testimony was systematically excluded from the official account. The land wasn't empty. It was farmed. Farmed with a sophistication that modern agriculture is only beginning to understand. Farmed by civilizations that fed millions, that built urban centers larger than London, that engineered food systems so resilient they had sustained continuous production for over 1,000 years. And then those civilizations were destroyed, not just the people, the knowledge, the infrastructure, the memory. What you are about to hear is not a theory. It is documented history. History that was collected, studied, and then quietly set aside because it did not fit the story that needed to be told about an empty continent waiting for civilization to arrive. This is what was removed from the record. The city they don't teach you about. Before we go anywhere else, we start here, with the city. A city that at its peak in roughly 1050 CE had a population estimated between 10,000 and 20,000 people. Some researchers put it higher. It sat at the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, near what is now St. Louis, Missouri. It covered more than 5 square miles. It contained over 120 earthen mounds, the largest of which, Monk's Mound, rose 10 stories high and had a base larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. The city was called Cahokia. Cahokia was not a camp. It was not a seasonal gathering place. It was a planned urban center with neighborhoods, public plazas, a woodhenge used for astronomical observation, and, critically, an agricultural economy sophisticated enough to feed a metropolitan population that would not be matched in North America again until the late 1700s. And almost no American schoolchild is taught about it. The agriculture that supported Cahokia wasn't subsistence farming. It was organized, surplus-producing, regionally integrated food production. Corn, specifically an Eastern Flint variety developed through generations of selective breeding, was grown in vast managed fields on the floodplains surrounding the city. Evidence from excavated storage pits and granary structures indicates that Cahokia's food system produced enough surplus to feed not just its own population, but the regional network of smaller communities tied into its economy. This was not primitive. This was not wild. This was civilization-scale agriculture, operating in the American Midwest, 500 years before the first European settlement. And then, sometime around 1350 CE, it declined. The population dispersed. The fields were abandoned. The forests returned. By the time European explorers reached the region, the mounds were there. The evidence was there. But the people who could explain it were gone, or displaced, or speaking languages that the Europeans had no interest in learning. So they called the mounds mysterious. They called them ancient. They wrote reports speculating that perhaps some lost white civilization had built them, because the alternative, that indigenous peoples had built a city larger than medieval London, did not fit the story they were already writing. What the soil remembers. There is a substance found in the Amazon basin that soil scientists have studied for decades without fully explaining. It is called Terra Preta, dark earth. It is found in patches scattered across the Amazon, a region that modern agricultural science considers among the least suitable for sustained farming. Tropical rainforest soils are notoriously poor for agriculture. The nutrients exist in the canopy, not the ground. Clear the trees and farm, and within a few seasons the soil is exhausted. That is the conventional understanding. But Terra Preta defies this understanding. It is dark, rich, deep. In some locations it extends 2 meters down. It contains high concentrations of charcoal, bone fragments, organic matter, and ceramics, the unmistakable signature of long-term human settlement and deliberate soil management. Carbon dating places its origins between roughly 450 BCE and 950 CE. Some patches are larger than 150 hectares. The remarkable thing about Terra Preta is not just that it exists, it is that it regenerates. Normal soil, once depleted, stays depleted without significant inputs. Terra Preta, studies have found, appears to rebuild itself. The microbial community within it is so dense and active that even when the dark earth is extracted and the surrounding soil is left, the dark earth returns within years. Archaeologists and soil scientists now believe the Amazon basin, the region we have been taught to think of as pristine, untouched wilderness, was once home to a network of settled, agricultural communities that may have housed millions of people and fundamentally transformed the ecology of the largest rainforest on Earth. Not just farming in the Amazon, engineering the Amazon. The implications are staggering. The Amazon we call wilderness is not entirely natural. It is in significant part a managed landscape, a food forest designed and maintained by civilizations that collapse removed from history. The Brazil nut tree, for example, which dominates certain forest canopies, does not self-seed effectively in dense forest. It requires disturbed ground, exactly the kind of ground that exists around human settlements. Its distribution across the Amazon closely maps population centers that archaeology is only beginning to locate. The forest remembered what history forgot. Before we go further, the pattern we are tracing here, sophisticated pre-colonial agriculture, deliberate erasure from the official record, evidence that keeps surfacing despite suppression, this is not marginal research. This is peer-reviewed archaeology published in Science, Nature, and the Journal of Archaeological Science. This is the work of researchers at the University of Florida, the University of Exeter, Harvard, and institutions across Brazil and Bolivia. It is not hidden because the evidence doesn't exist. It is hidden because acknowledging it fully would require rewriting the foundational narrative of American civilization, the narrative that says the land was empty, that says the pioneers were builders, not inheritors, that says what was taken was wilderness, not the ruins of someone else's world. Stay with us because what we haven't covered yet is the part they worked hardest to erase. The Three Sisters and the science behind them. You may have heard of the Three Sisters: corn, beans, and squash grown together in the same mound. What you likely weren't taught is the depth of the agricultural science embedded in that system. Corn is a heavy nitrogen feeder. It depletes soil nitrogen rapidly. Beans are nitrogen fixers. Through a symbiotic relationship with soil bacteria, they pull nitrogen from the air and deposit it in the root zone. Squash grows low and wide, shading the soil, reducing evaporation, suppressing weeds, and through the texture of its leaves, creating a microclimate that deters certain pests. This is not folk wisdom. This is a multi-crop integrated system that manages soil fertility, water retention, pest pressure, and yield simultaneously. Modern permaculture researchers have tested it in controlled conditions and confirmed that Three Sisters polyculture outperforms monoculture corn by significant margins in long-term soil health metrics. The system did not emerge by accident. It was developed, refined, passed through generations of careful observation and deliberate selection. The corn varieties used in the Three Sisters system were the product of roughly 9,000 years of breeding from a wild grass called teosinte, a grass that bears almost no visible resemblance to corn, into the productive cultivars that European settlers found and immediately began to rely on for their own survival. Without indigenous corn, the early European colonies do not survive. This is documented. The Pilgrims at Plymouth were not saved by their own farming knowledge. They were saved by Tisquantum Squanto, who taught them to plant corn in the indigenous manner, including the use of fish as fertilizer, a practice that maintained soil nitrogen levels in the thin New England soils. The colonists took the technique. They took the crop. They acknowledged the help briefly in their records, then proceeded to spend the next century driving the people who saved them off their land. The knowledge was taken, the people who held it were removed. The canal systems of the Southwest. In what is now Arizona, there is a canal system that engineers still study. The Hohokam people, a civilization that inhabited the Sonoran Desert from roughly 1 CE to 1450 CE, constructed over 1,000 miles of irrigation canals across the Salt and Gila River valleys. These were not simple ditches. They were engineered waterways, some of them 30 feet wide and 10 feet deep, with gradient slopes so precisely calculated that water flowed at the correct speed to prevent both silting and erosion. The system at its peak irrigated an estimated 110,000 acres of desert farmland and supported a population of tens of thousands in a region that receives less than 8 inches of rain per year. When Phoenix was founded in 1867, the settlers used the Hohokam canal beds as the foundations for their own irrigation system. They didn't build new canals, they rebuilt old ones. The infrastructure was already there, already surveyed, already positioned in exactly the locations that centuries of hydrological management had determined were optimal. Phoenix, one of the largest cities in the modern United States, sits on Hohokam agricultural infrastructure. The Hohokam disappeared before European contact, likely due to a combination of extended drought and flooding events that overwhelmed even their sophisticated water management. When the Spanish arrived, the canals were there, silted over, partially overgrown, but there. The knowledge of who built them was held by the surviving descendants, the Hohokam people, who had never actually gone anywhere, who were simply no longer being asked. The official narrative gave the irrigation credit to Mormon pioneers and Spanish missionaries. The canals were already there. The controlled burns and the managed prairie. The Great Plains grasslands, the prairie, were not natural wilderness. This is no longer a fringe claim. It is increasingly the scientific consensus. Ecologists studying the prairie have documented that its species composition, its structure, and its extraordinary productivity were the result of active management through controlled fire. Indigenous peoples across the plains used fire deliberately and precisely. Seasonal burns timed to the growth cycles of specific grass species. Burns that moved bison herds along specific routes, concentrating them for harvest, while also fertilizing the regrowth with ash, and stimulating the palatable grasses that kept the herds productive. Burns that prevented the encroachment of woody plants and maintained the open grassland structure that both bison and human communities required. This was not random burning, it was landscape management, continental in scale, multigenerational in practice, sophisticated enough to maintain an ecosystem that supported an estimated 30 to 60 million bison. When European settlers moved onto the plains, they exterminated the bison and stopped the burns. Within decades, the prairie ecology began to shift. Woody encroachment increased. Grass species composition changed. The soil, which under managed prairie had been accumulating organic matter and depth for centuries, began to be plowed. By 1935, the Dust Bowl had turned 100 million acres of the Great Plains into a desert. The topsoil that the plains communities had been building and maintaining for generations was gone in a decade of extractive agriculture that stripped away everything the managed landscape had produced. The Tartarian conspiracy theorists point to the Dust Bowl as evidence that indigenous knowledge was stolen and squandered. On this point, stripped of the fictional framing, they are not wrong. The Dust Bowl was the direct consequence of replacing a sophisticated managed landscape with extractive monoculture farming. What was lost was not just topsoil. It was the accumulated knowledge of how to live on that land without destroying it. The seed banks they tried to replace. When the Spanish arrived in what is now Mexico and Peru, they encountered crop diversity on a scale that defied their understanding of agriculture. In the Andes, the Inca and their predecessors had developed over 3,000 varieties of potato. Not 3, not 30, 3,000, each adapted to specific elevations, rainfall patterns, soil types, and storage requirements. Freeze-dried potato preservation, Chuño allowed long-term storage at altitude without refrigeration, a technology that sustained population centers in one of the most challenging agricultural environments on Earth. In Mesoamerica, maize had been developed into hundreds of varieties. Flint corns, flour corns, sweet corns, pop corns, each suited to different climates, different culinary uses, different ceremonial purposes. The genetic diversity of indigenous maize varieties represents one of the most complex feats of sustained selective breeding in human history. In the Amazon, the agricultural communities had developed cultivated varieties of manioc, cacao, acai, rubber, and dozens of other species, transforming forest plants into productive crops through generations of observation and selection. This diversity was not random. It was a biological insurance system. When one variety failed due to drought, disease, or pest pressure, others survived. The genetic breadth of indigenous crop varieties provided resilience across scales of time and geography that modern industrial agriculture, with its reliance on a handful of high-yield monoculture varieties, cannot match. Then the colonial agricultural system arrived. The Spanish introduced their own crops and suppressed indigenous ones. Colonial administrators actively discouraged traditional agriculture as part of broader civilizational replacement programs. Indigenous seed systems, which depended on community networks for maintenance and distribution, were disrupted when those communities were dispersed, enslaved, or killed. By the 20th century, the Green Revolution's introduction of standardized high-yield varieties had replaced traditional cultivars across much of the world. The 3,000 Andean potato varieties were reduced to a handful of commercial strains. The hundreds of maize varieties were replaced by hybrid corn that could not reproduce itself, seed that had to be purchased each season. The seed diversity that took thousands of years to develop was erased within a century. Some of it survived. Seed banks in Peru and Mexico and scattered communities still hold varieties that were never fully replaced. Researchers working with indigenous communities are now racing to document and preserve what remains before the last knowledge keepers die and the last traditional varieties disappear. The seeds remember what the history books don't. What the explorers actually wrote. The explorer accounts are more honest than what came after them. Hernando de Soto, traveling through the American Southeast in 1539 and 1540, recorded agricultural landscapes in the interior that his chroniclers described in terms that made clear the land was under active cultivation. Large towns with surrounding fields, granaries, complex political structures that coordinated agricultural production across regions. Jacques Cartier, exploring the St. Lawrence Valley in 1534 and 1535, described the Haudenosaunee town of Hochelaga, a stockaded settlement with communal longhouses and surrounding fields of corn, in terms that made its urban character unmistakable. He was not describing wilderness. He was describing a managed agricultural settlement. John Smith's accounts of Virginia in the early 1600s documented cleared fields, planted crops, and agricultural production systems maintained by the Powhatan Confederacy. The lands the English settled were not wilderness. They were former agricultural grounds, some recently abandoned due to epidemic disease that had swept through indigenous communities before Smith arrived, killing as much as 90% of the local population in some areas. This is the darkest piece of the story. The epidemics came first. Smallpox, measles, typhus, diseases for which indigenous populations had no acquired immunity, moved ahead of European settlement, carried by early contact with traders, missionaries, and explorers. In many regions, 50 to 90% of the indigenous population died before any significant European settlement began. Entire communities vanished, fields were abandoned, towns emptied, the forest returned. When the settlers arrived, they found what appeared to be wilderness, but was in fact the aftermath of demographic catastrophe. The cleared fields they planted in New England were fields that someone else had spent generations preparing. The open land they called virgin had been opened by epidemic disease, not by nature. The Pilgrims interpreted their fortune as divine providence. God had prepared the land for them. The actual explanation, that epidemic disease had killed the people whose labor had prepared it, appears in some of their own records, noted briefly and then set aside. The wilderness was a graveyard. The empty land was land from which the people had been removed, by disease if not yet by force. The agricultural inheritance the settlers claimed was real. The fiction was that it had no prior owner. What regenerative agriculture is actually recovering? There is a growing movement in contemporary agriculture, regenerative farming, permaculture, agroforestry, food forests, that is explicitly trying to move away from the extractive industrial model and towards something different. Something that works with soil ecology rather than against it, that uses polyculture rather than monoculture, that manages water at the landscape level, that incorporates perennial crops and tree systems, that prioritizes long-term soil health over short-term yield. The researchers and farmers building these systems often describe them as new, as innovative, as the cutting edge of agricultural science. They are not new. The Three Sisters system, Terra, Preta, Hohokam canal management, controlled prairie burning, Andean polyculture, Amazonian food forests, every core principle of regenerative agriculture was already being practiced, at scale, by pre-colonial agricultural civilizations across the Americas. The people now being celebrated for rediscovering these principles are, in almost every case, rediscovering something that was already known, something that was actively suppressed as the colonial agricultural model replaced what preceded it. Something that was dismissed as primitive and backwards at the same moment that the extractive system doing the dismissing was beginning its systematic destruction of the topsoil, the water tables, and the ecosystem stability that made agriculture possible in the first place. This is not to diminish the work of contemporary regenerative farmers. The rediscovery matters, the reconstruction matters. But it should be named honestly. The knowledge was not lost to time. It was removed from the people who held it. The farms were not forgotten, they were erased. The record was not incomplete by accident. It was incomplete by design, because a complete record would have required acknowledging that the land already had an owner, that the owner had developed something worth preserving, and that what replaced it was not progress. What belongs in the record? The history of agriculture in North America did not begin with European settlement. It began, depending on how you count, somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago, when the first deliberate cultivation of native plants began in what is now Mexico, and the long, slow work of domesticating maize from teosinte began. It continued through Cahokia and the Mississippian city networks, through the Hohokam canals, through the Haudenosaunee food systems, and the Andean terrace farms and the Amazonian forest gardens. By the time Europeans arrived, the Americas contained some of the most sophisticated agricultural systems on Earth. Those systems were not destroyed because they failed. They were not abandoned because they were inferior. They were destroyed because the people who built and maintained them were killed, displaced, and deliberately removed from the land they had shaped. The knowledge was not lost to history. It was excluded from the history that was written in European languages by European colonizers who needed the land to be empty and the agriculture to be new and the civilization to be absent. The farms were real, the knowledge was real, the people were real. And the land still holds the evidence. In the dark patches of soil that mark where Terra Preta communities shaped the Amazon, in the canal beds beneath Phoenix, in the seed banks that hold 3,000 potato varieties, in the charcoal layers beneath Midwestern fields, in the oral traditions of communities who never stopped knowing what happened, even when no one in power was listening. The investigation doesn't end here. It begins with a question that the official record still doesn't want to fully answer. What would American agriculture look like today if the knowledge that was erased had been preserved instead? If the people who built the farms had been treated as the scientists and engineers they were, rather than obstacles to be removed from the land they cultivated? We're starting to find out, not through discovery, through recovery. The farms were never really gone. They were waiting.